Okay, so I'm Carolyn Madden, as you've heard, and with me today is Kathy Friedrichs, and we're from Friends of Restorative Justice of Washtenaw County. And we want to give a big thanks to Jermaine Smith for the technology support. We've practiced a few times here, and she's been wonderful. So who are Friends of Restorative Justice? It's a secular and interfaith community organization. It's committed to a restorative rather than a punitive system of justice. We advocate for the use of alternatives to our current justice system with the use of restorative practices such as peacemaking circles, which you're all familiar with, and victim offender conferencing. We support these practices pre and post and during incarceration. And it's for healing of both the victim, for the one who caused the harm, and for the community. Why are we presenting this slideshow today? Well, one of the key players in any county criminal justice system is the prosecutor. So today we want to share with you and discuss what the role of the prosecutor is and hope to show why you should care who our next prosecutor is. There are 3 prosecutors running in the August primary. This is not a partisan presentation, but one that we hope educates about the power of the prosecutor and inspires you to care about who wins. Okay, more specifically, on the next slide, what we're hoping to accomplish today is to learn the impact prosecutors have in the criminal justice system and on your neighbors and community. Learn how your vote really helps to reform the justice system. Discuss experiences. We'd like to hear from you towards the end if you've had some experiences with the judicial system or the prosecutor system. And we want to help develop people's standards for prosecutors. The ACLU is currently also has a prosecutor, not forum, but they're trying to go to wider than we are, though. They're in full state trying to get all the prosecutor races, educate people about what the prosecutor does. And in the end, what they hope to get is from us, the people, what we'd like to see in the prosecutors, and they would be set up as guidelines for prosecutors. And we've worked with the ACLU a little bit, and so we hope to give them back some information. And we hope to help shape the kind of prosecutor's office you want for Washtenaw County. The next few slides are to give you a little context of what's happened over the past 40 or so years. This first slide is to show you that crime in the United States increased for a number of years from 1960 to the 1990s, and then we see a significant decrease in the crime trends. This is both for violent and property crime. Now, if you look at the next slide, we see the same thing similar in Michigan compared to the United States. And we see that the crime rate increased and now it's significantly decreasing. And if you look at the next slide, we see, ironically, while all this is happening, crime is decreasing, we see an increase in incarceration. And so after remaining steady for quite a while, the crime rate has now quadrupled in the mass incarceration, however, has quadrupled over the past 40 years. The United States, just a few interesting facts, the United States currently has the highest incarceration rate in the world, higher by far than China, Russia, and any country in Africa. It is almost 6 times the rate of Canada. And there's been a lot of national attention paid to mass incarceration. Maybe starting, one could say that started with Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. But the driver to incarceration happens locally. There are many people responsible for mass incarceration, the media, sensationalist media, tough on crime, politicians, and our own ignorance and trust in our officials without becoming aware of both the prosecutor's role and the judiciary role. And county prosecutors are usually very important in the number of people incarcerated, as we will see. Many of our prosecutors and other officials are stuck on the tough on crime mode. And the number of prosecutors that try cases has risen 50%, according to John Pfaff, between 1990 and 2007. John Pfaff is the author of a book called Locked In, and we will have a bibliography at the end of this, and it will be recorded, but you'll also have an opportunity that you can send to Kathy or myself, and we can send you the bibliography if you're interested. And he suggests that the increase may account, the increase that is in the number of cases tried by prosecutors, may account for the increase in prosecutions while the crime rate continues to decrease. The next slide just shows you the same kinds of trend in Washtenaw County and other jails, for example. So the vertical lines here show you the increase in those incarcerated in Michigan jails. And there was a Michigan task force recently set up by Bridget McCormick. It was set up by Gretchen Whitmer, our governor, and it was called the Michigan Task Force on Jail and Pretrial Incarceration. That will also be in the bibliography, and you can click on and find out what their results are. They asked the same question: why is this increase there? So the purple line here is the violent crime. That's sort of stayed steady. It went up a tiny bit and then came down. The blue line then is, let's see, I forgot now, let's see. Yeah, the total crime, sorry, yeah. So that's the total crime going down. But in our jails, we have a higher rate of incarceration. And their question was, why is this happening? What could be accounting for this? So some of the initial research at least shows that there are people pre-trial who are in jails, and they can wait up to 18 months in jail, and they haven't been convicted, of course, and some of that is because they can't afford bail. And so we know that cash bail is very harsh on the poor, and we'll be talking more a little bit about cash bail, what it does. But we can see that this increase could be related to that. It could be related to a lot of warrants that were out for people who had numerous tickets. I am happy to report that Jerry Clayton has reported recently that there's only about 150 people in the jails right now. So there's maybe by half, I'm not sure the numbers, but a reduction because of COVID-19. And he came out with a statement, and this is not a quote, but paraphrase, that maybe we need to look at how many people we put in our jails, and maybe this is a better way to do it anyway. So letting go of people who are not high risk, either having no cash bail at all, or reducing the bail, or other kinds of things that they might be able to do. Okay, so then Kathy is going to talk to you, get us started on what the role of the prosecutor is.
Okay, so today we want to learn about the role of the prosecutor into this whole picture of mass incarceration. And also I just want to reiterate something that Carolyn said earlier, because it's really important, because who oversees the prosecutor? The voters oversee the prosecutor. So really it's up to us to vote for the kind of prosecutor that we want. Okay, and the next slide, we'll see that each county elects their prosecutor every 4 years. And as Carolyn noted, we're going to have our election for the Washtenaw County prosecutor in November. So that's one of the reasons we're trying to get this information out as best we can. On the next slide, you'll see that in Washtenaw County, we have 26 assistant prosecutors, all full-time. And they all work under the prosecutor. So whatever policies or strategies the prosecutor has, they all follow. The other thing is that, excuse me, they are independent from the sheriff's office. The prosecutors may work together in some way, but they're really independent. And the budget for the prosecutor comes from the county commissioners, but the county commissioners do not oversee the prosecutor's office. So on the next slide, you'll see that the prosecutors exercise discretion at every stage of criminal proceedings. And Carolyn's going to take us through every one of those stages so that we can see how that works. So how can we evaluate the performance of a prosecutor? Well, there's very little data available, we have been told. So how can we truly assess if this person, the prosecutor, is doing the kind of work that we want if there's no data? So that's something we're going to talk about in a bit. So on the next slide, you'll see all the 6 stages of criminal prosecution: charging, bail, diversion, discovery, pleas, and sentencing. So Carolyn's going to take us through each of those.
Okay, so on charging, we're aware that after a person is arrested by the police, the prosecutor can charge the person with a crime or let them go. And they decide what crime to charge the person with. And of course, all the elements of the crime committed must be there, but the prosecutor does have some discretion. So it can be trespassing versus larceny versus breaking and entering, aggravated assault versus attempted murder. And one event can result in multiple charges. And so this is something that is sometimes referred to as overcharging. So a bar fight can result in assault, drunken disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest. You can have both first and second degree murder, and hoping therefore that one of those would stick, receiving pornography and possessing pornography. So each charged crime has a range of possible sentences associated with it. So indirectly, the prosecutor is also having some influence on the sentencing the person will face. Some of these crimes have mandatory minimum, which prevents early release for parole. And then juveniles, 14 and older, can be waived to adult court. Right now, we have a new law that guarantees that if you're, doesn't guarantee, it says that if you're 17, used to be 17, but now 17 is still in juvenile court. So you must be 18 to go to adult court. But there's still the availability of waiving that. So you can get some juveniles in adult courts. Okay, the next slide talks about cash bail. And judges ordinarily set the cash bail amount at a suspect's first court hearing. But as I mentioned before, referred cash bail often penalizes the poor people. And so while the decision is actually made by a judge or a magistrate, they often accept some of the recommendations of the prosecutor. Now, sitting in jail with a bail, for example, some people lose their jobs. Even after you're there for about 3 days, you can lose your job. You can't make money. You can't find a lawyer. So this may influence a person's willingness to take a plea. We've often heard, especially in the case of women, if there's no one to watch their children, they have to accept the plea. And 65% of people nationwide in jail have not been convicted of a crime. So they're in jails, pre-trial in jails. And they, as I mentioned, I think I mentioned, they can stay up to 18 months. And I'm not sure if that's statutory or not, but that they could stay up to 18 months in the jail. The other thing that people mention is sometimes having people in the jail waiting for their trial. Often they come out looking unkempt. Sometimes they're shackled. They have this orange, and it could prejudice the judge. So there's lots of reasons for trying to get people out of the prisons sooner, the jails, sorry. Okay, the next slide shows diversion. We do have some diversion in Washtenaw County, and the prosecutor can recommend the person be diverted to a program that's an alternative to incarceration, which the next slide will show what kind of diversion we have. In Washtenaw County, we have drug treatment courts, mental health treatment, VA courts. These are all in the district court. We'd like to advocate that we increase these diversion programs into the circuit court, which is the higher level court. Successfully completing these programs can result in charges being dropped or no longer for the person facing imprisonment. Right now, we also have some restorative justice. Again, as most of you are involved in, we have peacemaking circles and victim offender conferencing happening in the circuit court. We would very much like to see an increase in that. And Kathy is going to talk a little bit about restorative justice.
Okay, so why do we have diversion? Well, in a restorative system, restorative justice provides healing for the victim, which currently doesn't happen in our system, provides a way for the person who has created the harm to be accountable. It reduces recidivism and thus mass incarceration, and it helps the community heal. So on the next slide, I would like to sort of describe restorative justice as a paradigm shift. because the current system is a retributive system. It asks what law has been broken, who did it, and what punishment do they deserve. In a restorative program, we ask what harm has been committed, how can it be repaired, and the person committing the harm is held accountable. So in restorative justice in Washtenaw County, we use it in the juvenile drug court. It's being used in several high schools, local high schools, such as Skyline High School. Instead of suspension and expulsion, they actually use restorative justice to handle the issues that come up in the high school. And of course, a dispute resolution center, which you're all familiar with, offers alternative to solving conflicts in both the courts and in the community at large. So then Carolyn is going to continue with telling us more about discovery.
Okay, discovery is sharing evidence. So only the evidence that the prosecutor considers favorable and significant to the defendant's case needs to be shared. But the prosecutor does decide what evidence must be turned over. The prosecutors have the police as a resource for investigating the crime. And very often we hear cases about this evidence can be withheld until the last minute. So these are some of the negatives of prosecutors' discretion at this point. Okay, the next slide talks about pleas. So a plea determines what charges the defendant is given. And 95% of defendants plead guilty rather than exercise their constitutional right to have a trial. So this is where, just to make clear, where the defendant pleads guilty to a lesser set of charges to avoid being tried in court for more serious charges, usually. And so then if the defendant pleads, there is no jury trial. The prosecutor has complete discretion over what bargains to offer and what charges to threaten the defendant with. With little transparency about how this happens and the number of pleas, it's very hard to understand how this takes place. So this is a black box, can talk about as black box within a black box, not understanding how this goes on. More acts have been criminalized, and so another reason for the earlier increase in incarceration that we saw earlier. And of course, this is more efficient when you think about it. If you think about it, this 95% of defendants, if they all went to trial, it would take up a lot of time. And so there's always an argument about efficiency. But it's a question of whether this efficiency is, so much efficiency is really helpful for our fair and equitable judicial system. And so the Constitution does say that every person is guaranteed a trial. So we need to be thinking about that. And since the current prosecutors usually base their success on how many cases they win, they may bargain hardest for the weaker cases, forcing the defendant to accept a plea so the prosecutor doesn't lose a case. And judges ultimately must decide to accept the plea bargain, but the prosecutor has extraordinary power in this process to influence. Okay, the next one is on sentencing. The plea carries with it recommended sentencing. If there is no plea, the original charges carry their own sentencing mandates or guidelines, and the prosecutor weighs in here also with his or her recommended sentence. Again, the judge actually decides the sentencing, but here again, the prosecutor's recommendation carries great weight, and the prosecutor's choice of charges can control the judge's latitude in sentencing. So again, multiple charges increase the years in prison, reducing opportunity for parole and opportunity to reduce a person's ability to get out of jail and prison and to restore their lives. Okay, then Kathy's going to talk about a few other issues with the prosecutor's office.
So there are a few other problems that we see with the current prosecutor practices. So on the next slide, you'll see that bias has been, the research has shown that our current system disproportionately hurts poor people. We saw that in cash bail, the mentally ill, and minorities. The national incarceration rate for Blacks is 5 times as high as that of whites, and it's even higher in Michigan. Most prosecutors are white men. So if we want the prosecutor to be fair and unbiased, it's probably important for us to have diversity within the prosecutor's office. Some other problems are, you'll see on the next slide, a financial incentive. If the prosecutor sends defendants to prison, the state pays for that. If the prosecutor diverts the case to a diversion program, or they stay in jail, the county pays. So there's a real incentive to send people to prison so that the state will pay for that. And actually, it costs about $35,000 a year currently for one person in the prison system. So the victims are left out of this process. They don't get to ask questions about what happened, what was the defendant's motive. They are basically left unhealed. So restorative justice brings the victim into this process. And you'll see on the next slide, it promotes healing. And because currently the crime is defined as against the state, not really against the victim. So the prosecutor's office is not really transparent about why and what they do. They say they don't have statistics, but at least they don't share them with the general public. So again, how can we measure whether a prosecutor is doing what we want if there are no statistics? So on the next slide, you'll see that the Friends of Restorative Justice gathered some data in 2016. We sat in the juvenile court for about 6 months, and this is some of the results that we found. And I'll just go over a couple. Children are sometimes incarcerated. Children often take a plea, and there was a racial disparity, just as with adults. They also found that there's a preponderance of resisting arrest among juveniles, which is a felony charge. Now, we know that juvenile brains develop, our brains develop into our at least our early 20s. And so these younger people's brains are not developed. Not only that, once you're in prison, the likelihood is that you will return to prison. So is this really how we want to treat juveniles who resist arrest, is by sending them on a course into prison? It's something that I think we seriously need to think about. On the next slide, we're going to show you a short video about Adam John Foss, who was a prosecutor and is a supporter of restorative justice. So will you start that for us, Jermaine?
I feel a tremendous amount of responsibility to the people that I live around. It's just part of being a good community member, but also when you're a representative of the state, it's incumbent upon you to have that responsibility. The prosecutor holds all of the power in the criminal justice system. The definition of prosecutor is the person who represents the state when someone else is accused of a crime, and our job is twofold. One is to seek accountability from that person, but also to make sure that justice is done. Of course, there's no definition that's ever given us about what justice is. It's just our own definition of justice. There are so many examples just in everyday criminal justice practice where prosecutors are wielding this great amount of power without any oversight, and that's really where the damage is done, and people just never get to see it. They don't understand it. America has developed this problem in mass incarceration. It's an epidemic, certainly the biggest civil rights crisis of our time because of who it affects: poor people, sick people, and particularly people of color. In the late 80s, early 90s, people started to fear kids that we defined as super predators, and so all of a sudden we started making all these laws that made it much more easy for kids to go to jail.
Back to classes tomorrow, so CJ major. Yeah, look,
I was inspired to start working with young people in the justice system, and if you just took the opportunity to sit down with them and talk to them, you'd realize that they weren't criminals. They were just people that need a little bit of guidance, a little bit of direction. They don't need the criminal justice system. It's this line that we cross when we become professionals, where all of a sudden mistakes are no longer innocent because they're committed by people that don't look like us, that don't come from where we come from. Being raised by white conservative parents and living in a pretty white conservative neighborhood was difficult. While it was happening, it was informing me of things that I would do as a prosecutor later on in life without even knowing. And the perspective that I brought in was half my life being identified as a person of color, my other half of my life being the son of white Catholic parents. There are 2,300 prosecutors' offices around the country. 95% of the elected prosecutors in those offices are white. 86% of them are white men. And so right there you have the opportunity for disconnect. I left my job at the DA's office, start an organization to train prosecutors and teach them what are alternatives to incarceration in your community. It's about taking the people that are in the system and equipping them with the tools and the information to help resolve problems and not layer problems on top of people. The power of opportunity as opposed to the wrath of the criminal justice system. We need thousands of prosecutors to recognize that. There's a movement towards demanding more of your elected prosecutors. A lot of people spend all of their time and their effort focusing on Trump and Clinton, but the impact that a district attorney makes, especially in communities like the one that we're in now, are affecting those people daily. In an ideal world, 10 years from now, the justice system would look something a lot more cooperative and solution-based and a lot less adversarial. The outcomes would be much greater than just doing the same thing that we've been doing for the last 350 years and coming up with the same result every single time.
Carolyn?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to be talking about how things might be, and I wanted to just start this with a quote from Emily Basil, and we have her book in the bibliography also. She's a writer for the New York Times, and she's an author of Charged. That's the name of the book. And I think this fits right very well with Adam Foss's video. Prosecutors hold the key to change. They can protect against convicting the innocent, they can guard against racial bias, and they can curtail mass incarceration. So I think we can see that we could get a prosecutor's office that does what we want it to do. We can do all these positive things, as Adam Foss is suggesting. So on the next slide, I'll tell you how ways that from different sources that people are doing some things differently than in our own county at the moment. So in 2018, 2 district attorneys in Texas stopped charging people with misdemeanors for possessing small amounts of marijuana. In Harris County, which is Houston, Texas, District Attorney Kim Ogg started sending people to drug education classes without arresting them or giving them a ticket. So we do have something like that in our diversion courts at the district level. She also ended jail time for small retail thefts. And a lot of these ideas are coming from something called 21st Principles for the 21st Century Prosecutor, also in our bibliography. And in that, it's really highly recommending that we think seriously about using restorative justice practices. We're trying to decriminalize things. We're trying to rehabilitate and increase the chances of recidivism, recidivism. And so if you look at when you get the chance to look at the bibliography, this 21st Principles for the 21st Century has a number of wonderful ideas to suggest how things could be different. The next slide talks about how things might be different with cash bail. Well, of course, we can just eliminate cash bail. In 1976, Kentucky banned for-profit bail. In 2011, Kentucky passed a law requiring judges to release pretrial all individuals considered low and moderate risk for reoffending or flight. Following this success, Kentucky's Supreme Court instituted automatic pretrial release for most nonviolent defendants below a certain risk threshold. And New York just passed a no cash bail law, not without some controversy. It's not easy to get it all right because people are fearful that people are getting out who shouldn't be out. And again, this is not totally the prosecutor's purview, but of course the prosecutor has some discretion, has some influence here. And there is a statewide prosecutors association, just like there's a Washtenaw Bar Association, Michigan Bar Association. And they could influence this idea of stopping cash bail in Michigan. Okay, next slide shows in diversion. So in Washington, D.C., there was a 6-month diversion program. Alternatives to the Court experience serves teenagers who commit low-level offenses like vandalism and shoplifting. The program coordinators develop plans that include therapy, tutoring, mentoring, and school support. And this helps to reduce that idea of school to prison pipeline. In the program's first 2 years of existence, more than 90% of the participants were not rearrested. So again, recommending restorative justice practices and trying to work out restorative justice practices to treat the outcomes as the resolution of the charges. So if there's an outcome of restorative justice practice, maybe this can reduce some of the charges. Also, the 21st century along these lines of diversion programs is they're recommending considering restorative justice for adult as well as juvenile. We have juvenile programs with misdemeanors, but perhaps adult and juveniles for misdemeanor and felony offenses, including cases involving violence and injury. And you're going to hear something from Kathy later about this kind of programming. These programs all have a good track record of achieving lower rates of recidivism, better than traditional penalties, including for serious offenses. Sorry. The next slide is on discovery and what we could change for discovery. So currently, New York State lawmakers have passed a major overhaul of the laws that dictate what evidence must be turned over to defendants facing criminal charges. The new rules require that prosecutors share this evidence known as discovery at earlier stages of a case. If a defendant is facing felony charges, is offered a plea deal, information must be shared at least 3 days before his deadline to accept the plea. Michigan also has new civil and juvenile discovery rules to make discovery more timely for the defense. Next slide, we'll talk about pleas. So in 2016, Seattle prosecuting attorney Dan Satterberg introduced charging standards designed to ensure that the punishment for an offense is proportionate to the offense, so taking into account criminal history, but commensurate with the punishment imposed on others who have committed a similar offense. So here again, getting back to that idea of guidelines, that we might have some standardization of when people commit a crime here or in another county, could we have some standardization of what punishment is imposed? So the standards also in Seattle, the standards also caution prosecutors against filing every case that can be filed and against overcharging. Overcharging is when you charge multiple charges over time to obtain a guilty plea. So again, we're looking for prosecutors to not file as many cases that they've been filing. Okay, the next slide. On sentencing. So one of the most progressive prosecutors around right now is Larry Krasner from Philadelphia. And in 2018, he instructed prosecutors in his office to make plea offers below the bottom end of the sentencing guidelines for most crimes. So you're getting a benefit if you accept the plea. And when sentencing guidelines call for a sentence of 2 years or less, Krasner has instructed prosecutors generally to seek probation or alternative to incarceration. Okay, Kathy's going to try to summarize some of this before we go into our questions.
So what are some alternatives to sentencing and incarceration? Well, restorative justice programs include victim offender conferencing, which is happening in the trial courts, peacemaking circles in the juvenile court, and diversion, as we saw, mental health, veterans, and drug treatment in the district courts. So the next thing I'd like to talk to you about on the next slide is a program, and we think of it as a gold standard in restorative justice, and that's the Common Justice Program in New York City. This is run by Daniel Sered, who came to Michigan about 3 years ago and spoke to us. And it's been approved to handle violent felonies. And there are several steps here. So first, the victims and the defendants must agree to the process. A trained facilitator helps the parties to address the impacts of the crime, the resulting needs of the victims, and for the responsible party, his or her obligations. Then the parties agree on the remedies. And then responsible parties also must complete a violence intervention program. And those who complete the program successfully do not serve jail or prison sentences as they would have otherwise. Now, these programs usually last about 12 to 15 months, and the staff of the Common Justice actually follow to make sure that all agreements are adhered to. And there's a very, very low recidivism rate in this program. All right, so on the next slide, we start to think about what are the standards that we want to have in a prosecutor. And I'm just going to go over the next slides so you can think about it, and then we'll come back to the discussion. We'd like you to share some stories or experiences that you've had with prosecutors or the criminal justice system, and what kind of policies do you want to see in the prosecutor's office. So we're going to go through the rest of the slides, and then we'll stop the recording and we'll come back for the discussion. Okay, so the next slide is some suggested questions. If you go to hear prosecutors speak, people who are running for prosecutor, what do you want to ask them? Well, what will you do to make our community safe? How will you make the prosecutor's office work fairly, and more equitably for everyone? Again, we're looking for your ideas of what you would like to ask a prosecutor. On the next slide, we show some our emails and ask that you submit questions if you don't have a chance to give them here, or you want more information, or you like a copy of the bibliography. Please send them to myself or to Carolyn Madden, and this is our email. And I believe we have one more slide which shows the bibliography and some upcoming dates. Prosecutor Forum on July 14th, a Judicial Forum on July 15th, and a Sheriff's Office Forum on July 16th. So those are just some dates you might want to think about. So let's go back now to
There's a last slide is the bibliography.
Oh, okay. So this one is just, we are happy to send you a copy of this, given that it's pretty hard to read at this point. Again, just send us an email and we'll gladly send you a copy. So let's go back to the slide about discussions, and we'll then stop the recording. And Sally, I think you said that you would be willing to share some questions from the chat.